All right, the past couple of weeks, my son has done a couple of lessons for us. And we're on lesson 6 today. And each person we're dealing with is dealing with grace in their lives and how they dealt with situations. And of course, we're going to talk about Esther in the book of Esther, and about Esther herself and how she dealt with the situation at the time. And of course, this is called grace to seize the moment. So what have you learned in the past couple of weeks about any of these characters, Bible characters, personalities? What have you learned? Anything stands out to you? Sister Irby? There's human beings. They were human beings just like us. That's right. They had faith in the Lord to help them. They had situations, they had issues, just like we have, the same thing. I think after all these years and hundreds of years, we're people. We still have the same issues, same things we deal with, a lot of ways. Of course, the only way to deal with these things in life is what? Is have our trust in the Lord. You know. Anything else that you might learn? And quiet, Sunday morning quietness again. All right, let's go on. So hopefully you read the book of Esther. Not a very long book, but hopefully you read. So when trials happen in life, how do we have grace to address them? What kind? We need God's grace, but in this we're going to have an example of Esther's life, an example from Esther's life, how she dealt with her situation. Now, how many of y'all have read the book of Esther? This is a show of hands. Okay, so y'all have some familiarity with it. Some said, it's in the Bible, it is there. In case y'all didn't, it is there. So here are the topics for the book, the lesson this morning: the preparation of Esther, the indignation of Haman, and the declaration of Esther. So, introduction. Romans 8:28, and I think I have this written down here somewhere. Yep. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that love God, to them who are the called according to His purpose, from whom He did foreknow, He also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of His Son, that He might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom He did predestinate, them He also called, and whom He called, them He also justified, and whom He justified, them He also glorified. What shall we say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? And the first part of this is, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God. To those of us who belong to the Lord, we know all things work together. Don't we get into situations like, how is this? Why is this like this, Lord? I belong to you. You know. Well, the same thing with Esther. Esther's in a world that we're going to talk about here in a moment, where she lived at. So the Medo-Persian Empire. You see how it is all spread out there. And it says in Esther chapter 1, and it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. That's how massive his place was. You can see this empire. I want you to see this, get a relationship of how big his empire was. The Babylonian Empire has gone away. The Assyrian Empire has been conquered, so those two are gone away. Now the Medo-Persian Empire is taken over now. So this gives you an idea where these modern day countries are in relationship to this empire. This is my timeline. I like to see this timeline, but I want to show you, there's 4 slides of this timeline to show for you. I have hard copies of it up here for you after the class, if you'd like to have a hard copy of this. This is the timeline on how well you can see it. I tried the best. This is Job and Abraham and all that. Theocracy, the monarchy period when they had King Saul, King David, King Solomon, then the divided kingdom, of course, then the single kingdom, and then because the Assyrian captivity, the Babylonian captivity, and then the Medes and the Persians take over. So when they take over, this is called the post-exile period of this. So they've been in captivity. So I want you to see, now we're going to zoom in on this area right here where this red box is. And I label these pages A, B, C, and D. what they're labeled for. So here's the next page of that. So this is the time period. I don't know if you see this here, from 559 down to 486 here. And these are the different Persian rulers that were in charge at different times here. And during that time, the book of Ezra was written. The events of Ezra were taking place during that time period. So what I want you to see here is I want you to get the setting when the book of Esther is written and what was taking place. So by this time, the Israelites had been where? They've been, pardon? Been where? They've been, okay, but they've been all over. They've been in captivity. They've been taken in captivity by the Assyrians, by the Babylonians. So they've been away from their land. They've been spread out throughout these regions that you see. They're spread out through the Persian Empire, the Mede-Persian Empire. They're also spread out still there. But in the meantime, what's taking place is what? The book of Ezra has, I don't know if you see this one up here. This is the first time Zerubbabel leads captives back to Jerusalem. Those who are willing to be coming back to Jerusalem. So they were allowed to go back to Jerusalem if they wanted to. But what had happened to these Jews? Some of them. They got settled in. Even though they were captives in different lands, they become settled, they become adjusted to it, is where they become, instead of all of them getting up and leaving and moving back to Jerusalem and back into Israel, that area there, they did not do it. So what had happened here, this king Ahasuerus we have here, we're going to go to this next slide. This is the time period here. Don't let this distract you. I'll uncover those later for you as we go through the lesson. But I want you to see this part right now. From his time period, from 486 to 465, and about the end of that is when the book of Esther was written, somewhere late in that time, as best we can guess. So in that time period, these are the events that we're going to see in the book of Esther here. Just for a side note, the death of Buddha took place, the death of Confucius took place. These guys are dead and gone, of course. But I want you to have a relationship in world history where they lay in. But the book of Esther takes place here. There's a 6-month banquet thing taking place here, and you see in Esther chapter 1, verses 3, it says, "In the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces, bring before him. When he shewed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days." That's a long party, isn't it? A long time. Be showing off to all his princes. And in verse 5, "And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan." Shushan is the palace, both great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And he goes on describing all of that. "And they gave drink in vessels of gold," in verse 7, "the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance according to the state of the king, and the drinking was according to the law. None did compel, for so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure." So this is a wild party going on here. Drinking and everything else going on with it in this palace here. So in the meantime, what happens here is that it says here, "And also Vashti, the queen, made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded," if I pronounce these names right, hopefully, "Mehuham, Biztha, Habanah." Let me just skip the names, because it's going to be hard for me. "The 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus, the king, to bring," and what he told them to do is go bring Vashti to him. And to show, it said, "the queen before the king with the crown royal, to shew the people and the princess her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him." So she refused to come. Of course, one of his advisors says, "Well, this is not looking good. If the queen can refuse the king, then our wives can refuse us, and this is not going to be good throughout the whole kingdom." So they came up with a plan, and the idea was, you need to get rid of the queen, put her to the side, get rid of her, take her out of her place, don't be the queen anymore. And he says down here in verse 16, and Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to the princes and to all the people that are in the provinces of the king of Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes, and when it shall be reported. The king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti queen to be brought in before him, as she came not. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard of the deed of the queen. Thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and to let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, and that Vashti come no more before the king of Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. And when the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all the empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. And the saying pleased the king, and the princes and the kings did according to the word of Memucan. For he sent letters into all the king's provinces, and to every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, and every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. Of course, we all know that this part here where Vashti was put aside as the queen, no longer the queen. This, I don't know how you see this, how well you can see it, but there's going to be this is about it says the third year, and we're going to talk about the third year and the 12th year and all that. But here is when this feast takes place and Vashti is put aside. So let's move on. This is the other part. Let me back it up so you see. This is the continuation of this here, time period, just so you know. That's this part here. Of course, it gets to the time of the book of Malachi, and of course the time of our Lord Jesus Christ coming and being crucified, buried, and rose again. So that's that timeline of these 4 pages that I have for you. And of course, during this time is the book of Ezra being taken place, and the other returns of the other Jews returning back to Israel. So what are some interesting facts about the book of Esther that you may know of? That you may know of if we get deeper into this. Anybody? The name of God is nowhere mentioned in this book. Okay, good point. What else you might know? These are just like trivia questions. There's no test on this. There's no, just see if you might, some ideas to see what you might think of what you've read of this book. Anybody? There's a few, I had never heard of some of these. I thought it was really interesting too. All right, no takers? Okay. It's one of 2 books in the Bible named after women. What are the 2 books? Esther and Ruth. Ruth was a Gentile married to a Jew. Esther was a Jew married to a Gentile. Never thought about that. Never even related to thinking about that in that term. Events occur between the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's what I was trying to point out to you there. There's no mention of God in the book, but the Persian king is mentioned 192 times in 167 verses. But the Lord's never mentioned in this book at all. And some people question, is the book of Esther part of the Word of God? Should it be a part of the Word of God? Yes, it is. It is the Word of God. I believe so. And it should be there. And we'll see as you go through it that God was still working, even though His name is not mentioned through this book. So, the preparation of Esther. So, it says in chapter 2, and after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Verse 2, chapter 2, verse 2. Then said the king's servant that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they all may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan, the palace, to the house of the women, under the custody of Hegai, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women. And let their things for purification be given to them. And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shemiah, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity, which he had been carried away with Jehoiakim, king of Judah, which Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. Now, I'd already showed you that timeline up there where the Babylonian captivity had taken place. So during that time, his family was carried away in captivity. Mordecai's family. In verse 7, and he brought up Hadesh, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. For she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took her for his own daughter. So he adopted her, in a sense. Took her under his wing and raised her in all this. So in verse 8 it says, and it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together into Shushan, the palace, the custody of the Haggai, that Esther was brought also into the king's house to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women. Now think about this. You got a young lady who's being, all the virgins are being, beautiful young virgins are being collected to be what? What's happening? They're being collected to go to Shushan, the palace, to do what? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
To be presented to the king to see which one they need.
That's true. And she is one of those who's being taken there as well. Do you think that's a little scary for her? I think it would be a little scary for her. Well, it says here in we're down at verse 9. And the maiden, this is a general statement. And the maiden pleased him, talking about Esther. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. The keeper of the ladies, the women here, Haggai, it says here in verse 8, the custody of Haggai, that Esther was brought also into the king's house to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. And he speedily gave her things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meant to be given her, out of the king's house. And he referred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. Esther had not shewed her people, nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not shew it. She was not to reveal that she was a Jew. That's what she was not to do. So this guy here, the guy taking care of her, he saw favor. Esther had favor in his eyes, and he did what for her? Gave her special treatment, didn't he? He gave her the special place in the house. He gave her special treatment with maids to work with her, to help her. Because this purification process, it's going to take a year for purification process they go through. Because it says further down in verse 12, now when every maid's turn was come to go into King Ahasuerus, after they had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for it were in the days of their purification accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. Then thus came every maiden unto the king, whatsoever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women, to the custody of Shahazagaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in and unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she were called by name. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. This guy was still looking after her, Illustration. She was, don't you think she's a bit nervous about this whole thing? That's right. Think about it. It's going by faith, about this whole situation. Lord, where are you? Help me through this. The illustration is here. The African impala can jump to a height of over 10 feet and over a distance of greater than 30 feet. Yet these magnificent creatures can be kept in an enclosure in any zoo with a 3-foot tall fence. The animals will not jump if they cannot see where their feet will fall. Faith is the ability to trust in what we cannot see, and with the faith we are freed from the flimsy enclosures of life that only fear allows to entrap us. Think about that. Think about her situation, being put in this situation, Lord, trusting to God what's going on with her life here. She has been taken care of, and this is for a whole year. Think for a whole year she's going through this purification process. She's set aside like all these other virgins are set aside for a year for what they're having to go through. And then each one is individually brought to the king to spend a night with him. How scary could that be? So, moving on. Esther learned we can trust God's sovereignty and faithfulness. That's from the book here. The inclination of Ahasuerus, chapter 2 and verse 15 through 17. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abi, we already read this verse here. We'll go further down. She required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house, royal in the 10th month. In the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast unto all the princes and servants, even Esther's feast, and he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. And the virgins were gathered together the second time when Mordecai sat into the king's gate. So he did what? He spent a night with her. He chose her to be the queen. Of all those he had choices of, he chose her to be the queen and did a celebration for her, for this her being the queen. So the induction of Mordecai, Esther chapter 2, verse 21, if you go down there, says, in those days while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth, and sought to lay hands on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen. And Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. And that's an important part of this story here. What happens at this event is going to be related to later on in the story of Esther, of course. Because what? The induction of Mordecai. Mordecai was the keeper, he was at the gate, and he heard what? An assassination plot, wasn't it? And he reported to who? The queen. Who reported to who? The king. And then they got the inquiry about these guys, and what happened to these 2 guys? They were hanged on a tree, weren't they? And it says here, in verse 22, Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. So she had made known about Mordecai what he is the one who found this out. She gave credit where credit was due. So back to this timeline again. We've touched on some of these things already. And I know this is kind of a story that goes on. And I understand that. This is a story, but it is a story of 10 chapters and all that, what's going on. But getting the setting, what's happening here, it plays a lot for this to understand what's going on. And I like to see the timeline because it helps me to visually see. Because as I was doing this, I thought, I didn't realize that, as you go through it. But as you saw here, she's gathered with the other virgins. There's a 1-year purification. Then she becomes the queen. So sometime in here, we don't know. I don't have a date here because we don't know when this took place, right after this, how soon after, what year it took place. But this assassination plot was spoiled, I guess you want to say, foiled or whatever, by Mordecai reporting it to the king. So we don't know when exactly that took place. These other events, we'll touch on these in a moment here. We'll come up on these here in this, but I want you to see that we'll come back to these time later on. So the indignation of Haman, chapter 3. And after these things, the king Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Yeah, that's farther one. So this guy Haman is what promoted. And he's promoted, and what kind of attitude does he have? Very proud person of this, very much so. Because he's kind of like the king's vice president, I guess you want to call. He is the right-hand man to the king now, this position. Psalm 75, and I have that written down here. Psalm 75. Yeah, somewhere here. For promotion cometh neither from the east nor from the west nor from the south, but God is the judge. He put it down one and he set up another. Now think about it. The guy who reports the assassination is who? Mordecai, wasn't it? If I say the name right, we all. So he reports it, but he didn't get promoted, did he? So there's this guy named Haman, wherever in the world he comes from, he gets promoted to be like the second in command here, almost. Very close to the king. So the pride of Haman. You know, when Mordecai did not bow to him, he was not too happy, was he? He was not a happy camper at all. And Proverbs 13 and verse 10 says what? Talk about pride. Only by pride cometh contention, but with the well-advised is wisdom. Proverbs 6:16 through 19. These things doeth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. A proud look, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in running to mischief, false witness that speaketh lies, and he that soweth discord among brethren. Interesting, we talked about this before in the book of Proverbs. These 6 things, what do we think? We think hands that shed innocent blood. Oh, that's pretty serious now. That's serious stuff, isn't it? But what's on that list here? Pride. Pride is in that list. A proud look, a lying tongue. It's all on that same list with these other things we've seen. Yeah, that's pretty bad, but this is also bad as well. God hates these things, does he not? James 4 says, and I have that written down here, of course, but he giveth, to my God, giveth grace, wherefore he saith, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Illustration here for you again. I like this illustration. I don't know if y'all like this one or not. A turtle once wanted to spend the winter in Florida, but he knew he could never walk that far. He convinced a couple of geese to help him. Each would take one end of a piece of rope while he clamped his vice-like jaws in the center. The flight went fine until someone on the ground looked up in admiration and asked, "Who in the world thought of that?" Unable to resist the chance to take credit, the turtle opened his mouth to shout, "I did." Immediately he plummeted to his death. Pride can affect you, can't it? And that's what affected him. I thought it was a cute little illustration here. So the picture of Haman. How do you think? We're talking about the biblical picture of Haman. What is it? What's the picture of this guy? He hates the Jews, does he not? Let's go back and let me go back in here. I got to get to the verse. Where's that? Where is that? Let's go back to where Haman Mordecai did not bow. In chapter 3, in verse 4. And it came to pass when they spake daily unto him, and he heareth, hearken not unto them. That's those servants were talking to Mordecai, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of excuse me. Excuse me. Excuse me. Then was, where was that? And he thought, and it said, when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had shewed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. In the first month, that is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman from day to day and from month to month to 12th month and to the month Adar. I had to read that and try and figure this out, but what I understood right is that Haman was mad, wanted to get rid of the Jews, so he had to try to figure out, they cast lots to find out when's the best time to do this. So they cast lots and they narrowed it down to what? The 12th month, from day to day, and from the 12th month to the 12th month that is in the month of Adar. So they figured out when they're going to do this, get rid of the Jews. And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people gathered abroad, dispersed among the people in all the provinces of the kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasures. 10,000 talents, I think I saw it was like almost $15 million was there. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemies. And keep that in mind, the Jews' enemies. And the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to thee, the people also to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. Then were the king's scribes called in the 10th day of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants and to the governors that were over every province, and to the rulers of every people in every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus was it written, and sealed with the king's ring. And the letters were sent by post unto all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even unto the 13th day, the 12th month, after in the manner of Adar, which in the month of Adar, and to take spoil of them for a prey. The copy of the writing for a commandment to be given to every province was published unto all people, that they should be read against that day. The post went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan, the palace. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. Now, I know I read a lot to you there, but what happened? Haman was given authority to write have these letters written. The scribes wrote them, and they did what? They sent them out to all the different provinces out there for him. He has no concern for these Jews, but what? To eliminate them. The picture of Haman is what? Matthew chapter 24. What is that? When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them be in Judea flee unto the mountains. What is Haman representing here? Kind of what representing about the Jews, in relationship to the Jews. The Lord talked about in Matthew here what was going to take place. I'm sorry?
It was like the Antichrist.
Like the Antichrist, wasn't he? Hasn't the devil tried to use people throughout history trying to get rid of the Jews? Constantly. Whoever it might have been, trying to use different people. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 2-3, it says, I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. I will bless thee that bless thee, and I will curse him that what? Curseth thee. And it shall be, in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Isn't it obvious that Haman is cursing the Jews at this time? He is there. It says there, he is the Jews' enemy. To get rid of them. Yes?
Well, the historical thing here, if you go back in the first Samuel, remember when Saul started destroying Amalekites and destroy everything?
Yep.
He did except for the king, who was Agag.
Yep.
The king was an Agagite, so the son of Agag was the one that's trying to destroy the kingship.
That's good. Yep, I thought about that. I didn't bring it up, but yes, good point. Yeah, because Saul was supposed to kill all the Agagites, but he didn't do it. Didn't he? So it comes back after years later, showing up. So the plan of Haman. We read the plan of Haman. I kind of read further. I need to, but I read the plan of Haman there for you. Now, back to this. I don't know how you can see that, but this is when Mordecai foiled the assassination. This is this year here, the 12th year here, where it says. It says here in the 12th year, in the first month, Haman observed casting of the lots, the pur as they call it. Casting of the lots to determine when to do the annihilation of all the Jews. The next time it says here in Esther chapter 3, verse 12, the first month of the 13th day, decree was issued to kill all the Jews. We'll come back to the others here in a second. So the declaration of Esther, this is the last section there. Mordecai's identification, chapter 4, verse 1, which we already saw. When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and a bitter cry. Can you picture that? He's heard of this decree that's been told in the city he's in, as in all the prophets has been told that, and he puts on sackcloth. He's out in the street crying out. And he says he went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud voice and a bitter cry, and came, verse 2, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. In every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Can you imagine if you were one of those Jews and you get this decree, and the decree says what? You're going to be killed, but it says also when it's going to take place. The decree goes out, well, I don't have the decree goes out the first month. Goes out. When is the decree supposed to go in place? When? The 12th month. Think about that. So you know there's a decree that's been sent out, and you got, depending on how fast the news got to you, probably got pretty fast, because they were pretty fast about they got a major road they travel as well. But it gets out to you. Say you got 11 months, 10 months, whatever. You know that this is the plan for your government to kill you. You think about that. So what would you be doing? You'd be fasting and praying, wouldn't you? Or would you be, well, okay, we'll see what happens when it happens. Well, this life will just keep going on. Oh, we got plenty of time. Your wife says, honey, we don't have a lot of time. So, oh, we got plenty of time. No, you don't. Because that time's going to go by fast. Doesn't make any difference. Would you not be doing that? Fasting and praying, just like these Jews were doing at this time. They were doing what it says here. In every province, whithersoever the king's command and his decree came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Can you imagine that throughout that whole province, the empire where the Jews were at? This is taking place. So let's get back to this. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 14. I have this here. Do all things without murmurings and disputings, that you may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world, holding forth the word of life, and that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, neither labored in vain. So they were weeping and crying, and they were in sackcloth and all that. And it says they were also fasting as well. So what does Esther do here? Esther finds out why is Mordecai down there doing it? What is going on? Because she's not aware of this decree that went out. So I got to zip through this now. Oh, I forgot about this phrase here. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Or Edwin Burke wrote that back in the 1700s, 1800s. Mordecai's instructions. In chapter 4, verse 13, Mordecai tells her, Then Mordecai commanded to Esther, Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance rise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed, and who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? In verse 15, then Esther bade them return to Mordecai this answer, Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me. Neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. So what was his instructions to her? What was Mordecai's instruction to Queen Esther? You're one of us. You're one of us. You're a Jew just like the rest of us. As soon as it's known, you're also gone as well. But you also need to step up and do something to help out with the situation, right? So, and like he said, how do we, what's the verse, the good phrase here, and I can't see it. Time is this, verse 14. Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And I think she was put in that position for a time as this, for this situation, what she was to do. And she also asked of him to go and get the Jews together and to do what? To fast for her and to pray for her. What does it say? It doesn't say to fast ye for me, neither eat nor drink 3 days nor night. Well, I think it doesn't say the word pray, but I think with fasting they're going to be praying as well. I got to get through this. Space Shuttle Columbia disaster that took place back in 2003. Isn't this a disaster that was getting ready to take place for them? But it was faith to deal with this. It took faith to go through what they had to go through. Now this situation here, it says on February the 1st, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia prepared to return to Earth. Instead, a tragic accident occurred and the crew members were killed. One of those crew members was Michael Anderson, a strong Christian. Before the mission, he reported to have said, if this thing doesn't come out right, don't worry about me. I'm just going on higher. Another member of the mission, Rick Husband, made 34 video devotionals before he left on the Columbia. There were 17 for his daughter and 17 for his son. One for each day he was to be gone. Even in the wake of a national tragedy, the testimony of these two men impacted Christians across the country. They left a painful legacy of strong faith for us to look back to. When I was reading through the book of Esther, a verse popped out to me, and I saw it in the lesson too as well, was, since God's name's not mentioned in here, what do you think about it? The verse that says, for we walk by faith and not by sight. And that's what was happening here. They were walking by faith and not by sight. Chapter 4, verse 15, I think and then Esther, we did all that. 16, we said all that. Mark chapter 9, I got this here. I got to rush, I'm rushing now. And when he was coming to the house, his disciples asked him privately, why could not we cast him out? And he said unto them, this kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting. When you have a situation in your life Doesn't kind of trying to jolt your attention to do something? To do what? You're trusting the Lord. Yeah, you trust in the Lord, but then you do what? Sometimes you have to just stop and fast and pray. And when you're fasting, what's happening there? Don't say you're starving to death either. You're not starving to death.
You're focusing totally on prayer.
You're being focused on what you're praying about and showing the earnesty, aren't you not? Between you. And you don't go around, I'm fasting today, you're wearing a badge. You don't let anybody know that. You just do like your normal life and everything. You just do what you do. But it's between you and the Lord that this is really important to you. Yeah. 1 Peter 5:7 here says, casting all your cares upon him, for he careth for you. Back to this. I'm having to zip through a lot of Esther to get there. This book here. Of course, we know that Esther goes before the king. They prayed 3 days, all that. They did the fasting. She was able to go before the king, which is against the rules to go unless the king allows you to come in. The king allowed her to come in. And she asked something of him. And what did she ask of him? She asked to have a feast. And she only asked for 2 people to be there, the king and Haman, because she knew about Haman. So they come there the first night, and the king says, I'll give you half the kingdom. She doesn't ask, says, what's your request? She says, come back for dinner the next night. So they come back to dinner the next night. But in the meantime, Haman is what? He's still ticked off with Mordecai. He goes back to his family, and he tells them, this is what this Mordecai, he will not bow to me. And they said, well, build a gallows. And he builds a gallows, doesn't he? I'm zipping through this a lot, verses here for you, chapters, get through this. He builds a gallows. So the second night, while the king is not able to sleep, between the 2 meetings, the fast of the first night, the king is not able to sleep, so they bring out the Chronicles, and they read the Chronicles to the king. And verse 6, chapter 6, verse 1. And on that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and it was read before the king, and it was found written that Mordecai had told of I'm going to shorten this up, the assassination plot. And the king said, verse 3, and what honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai? Then said the king's servant that ministered unto him, there is nothing done for him. So the king wanted what? He wanted to honor Mordecai. Of course, Haman thinks, hey, I'm coming in. And the king asked him the question, what should I do for the person that is in verse 4? And the king said, who is in the court? And they said, Haman. In verse 5, let's move down here for it. Verse 6. So Haman comes in, and the king says unto him, what shall be done unto him whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? He thought it was him, but it wasn't him. And so he had to install the honor on Mordecai. Mordecai was given the honor and all that. The feast took place again the second night. And Esther points out it's Haman who wrote this decree to kill all the Jews. And of course, what happens to Haman? He is hung on the gallows that he had built. And Esther is given his property. Mordecai is able to write a counter decree. He writes a counter decree on the 3rd month. And on the 12th day, on the 12th month, the 13th day, the Jews were able to defend themselves. Were they not? Because the decree was already issued earlier, so now they were able to defend themselves. I know I'm shortening this whole up for you. Haman's 10 sons were hanged on the 14th day in the 12th month. I thought it was interesting, from that long period of time, from the time Haman was hanged, his sons were hanged a little bit way off. I'm sorry I rushed through this. I thought I'd get through it better than this. But the idea is that we did not see God's name in this book, right? But we saw God's hand working in everything that was taking place here. Even though Haman was appointed the second in command, but he was the most evil person around, trying to get rid of the Jews. But what? God had a plan for him too, and got rid of him. The guy who was at the gate, the little guy who was at the gate, Mordecai, winds up being promoted to that position, replacing him by God's hand. And it's by God's hand that he took and got, in what? Countered the decree and got rid of the enemies of the Jews. And there was a lot of people who says there they turned and wanted to be Jews because they didn't want to get killed either. But God worked all this out in all of this. One last point for you, this side note. You see the year is 465. That's when Haman's reign ended. He was assassinated by the captain of his bodyguards at that time. But he eventually was assassinated. Ahasuerus was not a great king, a kind king and all that. He just found favor with a young lady named Esther and promoted her to be queen, who saved her people in what she did. But she was willing to do what? She was willing to put her life on the line to do that, to be involved. Any comments, any questions? I apologize for zipping so fast. I know that's, put this up there. The calling on our lives is to share the gospel of Christ with the world. But none of these things move me, neither count I my life dear unto myself, so that I might finish my course with joy and with ministry which I received of the Lord Jesus, to testify the gospel of the grace of God. You know, Esther had to consider that herself, as far as her life is not that important as this to help her people, no matter what, to help her own people. Comments, any questions? I think next week we talk about Peter. We're dealing with Apostle Peter next week. All right, let's go, Lord, in prayer, and we'll be dismissed.